So how are you this morning?
Well, I'm well, and you?
Very good, thank you. And thank you for doing my last conversation
Yes,
with me.
of course.
Yeah. So everybody knows Sharon Erickson, but I'd like Sharon to tell us her involvement with the church finances throughout the years, and most
Sure.
prominently this year, I think, right?
Well, yeah, so I've been a moderator in this church and a member of a budget team, but also this year I'm the financial secretary. So what this means is I'm the one who pays attention to what's coming in. Our treasurers pay attention to what's going out. The budget committee, if you don't mind, I'm going to leap right into that. It's one of those things that I think isn't well understood, and I really appreciated the video that we saw this morning about church business. Unfortunately or fortunately, there's stuff you have to do as a church that doesn't feel very churchy.
Mm-hmm.
It feels kind of more businessy, and people get kind of their backs up a little bit about that, but they referred to the IRS rules. We all have to follow them. We also have to follow rules about being a nonprofit. We all have to do all those things. And maybe the most importantly about the finance team in this church and probably many others is that we're here to be stewards of what the congregation as a whole has decided that they want to do, but also be in conversation with the congregation about what it is that we should be doing. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of an ongoing, I always feel like we're doing yes and instead of no but, always as we talk about the budget and talk about our giving and talk about what we need to do to I think we've used words like step out in faith or how we might accurately reflect our values.
Yeah.
So
Very nice. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'd like to read this poem to you, and it's by Sarah R. Speed, and it's entitled Pocket-Sized Moments. I wonder if we will know when restoration comes. Will it feel big and dramatic like a summer rain? Joyful and overwhelming like an end of a war parade? Maybe. Or will it be small? Will it be pocket-sized moments like wishing on stars, the sun through the curtains, or the lightning bugs in the yard? Maybe. I don't know how God will restore this world, just like I don't know how to make the summer rain. But I do know how to say I'm sorry. I do know how to love with all of me. And I know how to say, this cup is for you, and I know how to taste grace in grape juice. So on the off chance that restoration will be small, pocket-sized moments of love for all, I will break bread and save a seat for you. I'll say I'm sorry, and I love you too. I will plant gardens and look for fireflies. I will say prayers on the shooting stars at night. And when the sun shines through my curtain windows, remind me to open them wide. I would hate to miss God's parade, these holy, ordinary days. So. In your introduction, I think you captured beautifully the challenge of money in church, the paradoxical nature of it, right? We're asked to be a people of faith, and on one hand, see all the abundance and the grace of God. But on the other hand, we've got this practical reality of how we're going to live out this money story. And it is a money story. It's a story just like all of our other spiritual aspects are. So I think in our journal, they asked us to start off with writing your own money story.
I am not so good at my own money story. I grew up in the Midwest, raised by people who were in the Depression. There was never going to be enough,
Right.
ever.
Mm-hmm.
Not ever. We had to use everything. I think many of us are of an age so that we also were raised in that sort of, there isn't enough. Abundance is not a concept I probably heard until I was pretty old, like probably last week, you know?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe it wasn't that, but it just wasn't something that we considered. And I think that tied to me in terms of like church in general, Big C. It hasn't been that long ago that we had to come to terms with things like, gosh, we have master's prepared people who are our clergy, we need to pay them like they're actually master's prepared people. I think education, I think nursing, I think all of the sort of helping professions have shaped up to this same sort of, why do we expect people to retire on absolutely nothing, which what used to happen to pastors? So that was like a start to be a just employer. And that kind of has kept going in our current conversation from how do we go from doing charity, we'll give and make ourselves get more stars in our crown or whatever, to actually doing justice all the time, every way that we can, and using our resources. We're so lucky to have money in money in investments, because many churches don't, and that investment, but that investment also needs to be treated like something like a pot of gold that you really can't just spend like drunken sailors. You gotta, I'm not saying that's what we've done, but to have the idea that there's still things that we want to do that do justice rather than kind of giving money away a little bit that we feel good about.
Well, it feeds into your gospel story, right? The money in and of itself is a story, but what I'm hearing you say is that using that money to feed in the story of what you value as gospel people is the main importance. For me, the money story, when I said money story, that doesn't really, when I think of story, I think of delight and I think of joy. When I think of money story, it's a whole different feeling. And my grandparents grew up during the Depression, so there was always this not enough. You always heard, don't waste this and don't waste that. But on the other hand, they had come as immigrants to the land of abundance. And being Italian, there was this notion of abundance on one hand and scarcity on the other. So I've realized that I've picked up both threads of that, and I've really never really reconciled them. And I don't know if I can. There's always a part of me that can be super generous, but then there's a part of me that goes around the house shutting all the lights off. It's like, I feel like I'm bipolar or something. It's like, I don't know if that can ever really truly be reconciled. And I think part of what I hear in the church's story as a leader is I don't think it's meant to be reconciled. I think it's meant to be discerned. I don't think, because when doing the journal for the 4 weeks, Ash Money Story, I kept thinking to myself, but people are going to want to have a prescription of how to do this, right? There is no prescription. So I think struggling with the issue honestly and having those hard conversations is what's really required of us, and that's the best we can do. And part of being on the budget team this past year, though I wasn't on it, but I went to some of the meetings, it's a struggle. It truly is a struggle. And I think the honesty of that is what's going to lead us into making those wiser decisions like the churches had to make. If they were going to keep alive, were they going to have a not-for-profit help them financially in their money issues? So yeah. So are there any overlaps between the scarcity on one hand and the abundance on the other hand?
Oh, always. And as you say, I think there's tension between those two things. And I would refer back to we try to give ourselves on the budget team a couple months before the budget is due, just, kind of, because not everybody is part of this, before the budget is due so that we can kind of work out, well, here's what we spent last year. Does that still feel like the things that we want to do? Here's what we think we would like to get involved in based on conversations we've had over the course of the year. And there's almost always places where we go, no, it has to be this way. No, it has to be this way. And we have tried, I think, always to err on the side of grace and abundance. Clay has been a real leader for us in this, it's not enough money, it's not a balanced budget, it's not this, it's not that, but what is it instead? And so how do we keep being good stewards, listen to the congregation, do the best job we can with what we have, and then work forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that it's not always comfortable, as you say. That struggle of it is hard, and I think sometimes maybe that's why I want to talk about it a little bit today, because partially we're looking for other people to be involved with us. It gets to be the same people around the table, and after a while, your ideas are not that fresh anymore. You need new ideas
Mm-hmm.
and new ways of thinking about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes to a thing that I think about, that tension between scarcity and abundance, is having the courage to say, what if? What if we did this? What if we thought about things in a different way?
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've done that over the last 3 years, but to, you know, to keep doing that what if and
The
not
what
go,
if,
okay,
yeah.
we're good.
Yeah.
We've landed.
Yeah,
It's enough.
And I like the idea of fresh eyes too, because I think when you get, because I see this on Committee on Ministry, when you have mids coming in and they're young mids going for seminary and looking to be ordained, they're living through a church life now that's, the theology is deconstructing and everything is changing rapidly. So they don't have that same traditional language, but they're saying basically the same faith story and journey that we know spiritually. So when you have new people dealing with money, I think that's when you can hear the what ifs. You know, the what if we did something that was like co-op or collaborative. You know, it's not just like we're church and we have to pay for everything. And I think those what ifs are so important, to be able to step out of the either or box. You know, either we have a balanced budget or we don't. And that's the way we look at least I've looked at it. You know, it's either balanced or not. Until I went to Forest Grove for 3 months in 2014, and I was left with annual conference while the pastor was away. And this was the first time the church didn't have a balanced budget. But it took one young man to say, what if? What if we don't have the balanced budget and we collaborate with a group of people and the money comes in a different way? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting. The word restore is to give back and to return. So what do you think as a faith community we need to give back in return?
Well, this is part of my what if. What if we used some of our resources, and this is going forward, we've done a good job with all of this in the past, but what if we thought more about changing the economy so that it's not focused on individuals and was more about how we stay together as communities? Because
Mhm.
communities aren't based on, what is that thing about there's no I in team? There's no I in team. There's only all of us trying to figure this out together.
Mhm,
And unfortunately, in this culture, we're sort of used to saying, oh, well, the leaders will fix it. Well, you know, they're really not that much smarter than anybody else, usually.
That's right.
So, yeah, well, they're just not.
We're not.
You know, we're just not. So how do you get away from that sort of pyramidal leadership structure?
The hierarchy.
Yeah, and don't do things like that
And
anymore.
that's the safety of going to a church that does have a hierarchy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because when the church has a hierarchy, they can funnel money from the top down into the congregations, which
Yeah.
keep a lot of the smaller congregations alive.
Yeah.
We do not have that luxury, if it's a luxury, but we're not entitled that
No.
way. Yeah.
No, I want to say something else. You sent us an article from Herb Montgomery, which I kind of hope we would share with everybody, that talked about that Fishing for Men story,
Mm-hmm.
and decolonized it, and talked about that it wasn't ever about evangelizing.
It was never about
And
evangelizing.
it really was about deposing people in power. Well, that's a whole different way of looking at the world, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm not worried about people sitting in the pews, if I'm worried about the justice that happens in my neighborhood, that might look very different.
Or if we're concerned about creation as a whole, and we don't even
Yes.
start with people, right?
Yeah.
We have the tendency to go, and this is one of the critiques they make of Tellier de Chardin, who has a wonderful evolutionary creation hope for the world, right? We'll see Christ in everything, but they said he was highly focused on man or humanity being the way to evolve. And it wasn't so much the indigenous notion of all of creation, right?
Yeah.
So it's a whole different slant, and that's decolonizing right there, is when we can think, maybe my gardening with organics and taking care of my community garden is a way of being sacred in this world, as much as, feeding money into a church or doing things with people. Yeah. I mean, because I see it with Elliot and I see it with my grandkids. I mean, they're very, fanatical about, you throw things out the right way and you look at the bugs and you honor the bugs. I mean, when we were kids, I don't know what you did, but you stepped on. No, it was like a worm, just step on it.
Step on it, yeah. We don't need those.
And that gives me so much hope that is coming back into our consciousness. I think we lost it as colonized people. That's what we really lost, if we ever had it. And I think we did have it. I think the immigrants coming from Europe, to some sense, as peasants, did have it. But I think what happens is when people are coming as exiled people into a new world that promises abundance, and they're there to survive, you lose that quickly. It almost gets taken away from you.
Well, and I think we try to force people into our model almost as soon as they land. Why don't you speak English? Why don't you do this? Why don't you be just like us? Well, because I'm not. I wasn't. That's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Most of the people I grew up with were maybe, and I think that's true for you too, maybe first generation. We had people who had still very strong German and Norwegian accents when I was growing up, because, if they didn't grow up speaking those two languages, certainly their parents spoke them, and that was the language they learned at home. But they wanted to be like everybody else in school as soon as possible. If I think about it on those, levels. And then if I think about when Native Americans would come to school, if I think about it like that, we had a whole set of things that we believed about Native Americans, most of which weren't true. That they all got money from somebody somewhere. They get checks every week. No, they don't. That's silly. And many of the other sort of myths that we've told ourselves about why white is right.
Why we're superior. Yeah. And we're the blessed United States. Yeah. I worked for a shipping company when we lived in Miami, and the shipping company basically was products from South America and the Caribbean. And there were quite a few Cuban people working in the shipping company. And it would really, I found this so entertaining in such a sad way. They would often tell me that they had stories of family that would come to the United States. And the first thing that they would do, coming from Cuba to the United States, would send pictures back to their relatives in Cuba. So I'd ask them, what kind of pictures are you sending? Well, we go to somebody's house that has a large house with 5 cars in the driveway, and we tell them that's our house and our cars.
Yes.
So they're setting up this whole false notion of this promised land of Disney World over here, while these poor people are still in Cuba, oppressed and not making money, and then they come here thinking that that's what everybody does once they get here. And it was just such a distorted way of enticing people to come here, but that's kind of the ideology that we're up against.
I think we sell, I think of our media, that not newspapers, but movies. Everybody has a way nicer house than mine. Everybody's got way more money than anyone that I've ever known. Everybody's got all this stuff. That's not real life.
No.
Most of us are not well off. Most of us are lucky to get from one. Most of us are 2 paychecks away from homelessness. And that's been true for 40 years.
Yeah.
So how do we change our ideas about all of this?
Right.
Yeah.
And when we have that idea of, the whole idea that people are wealthy here because it's the land of opportunity, but then you hear something like Beaverton has the highest rate of houseless teenagers living in cars. I mean, I can't wrap my head around that. It's just it.
No, there was a conversation in Gresham a couple of years ago, similar to that, oh, well, we don't have to worry about homeless kids because, that's not real life. one of the schools in Gresham has had a homeless coordinator for kids in high school for something like 25 years. So, we tell ourselves these stories that make everything look good, and they're not so much. So I always think maybe a little more reality and a little less myth-making about restoration would also be really important. Yeah.
Having the correct history behind things,
Yeah.
So now we come to the story in John's Gospel in chapter 21. And it's interesting to note that John's Gospel ended at chapter 19 with the resurrection. So everything after that was commentary that was tagged on. So we have this story about Jesus coming and watching his disciples not catching fish. And then they come in and they go through the whole thing of Jesus asking Peter if he loves him 3 times. But he does say to them at one point when they're not catching fish, and they have to admit they're not catching fish, which I found very interesting to read that, right? He actually asked them, like, are you, like, reality check, are you catching anything? No. He instructs them to fish on the other side of the boat. And when I first started in the UCC, in the conference in New York, that was that theme, let's fish on the other side of the boat. So what might that look like?
It means inviting people to be with us who have not been with us in the past. It means to be uncomfortable with people's different cultural expectations. It means, to me, to be on the other side of the boat. I guess that's how I would think of it, is, so if you're doing a knot on one side of the boat, how could you do it? It's a what if, what if you fished on the other side of the boat? What would happen? Let's just see.
Yeah, and I think we've taken that approach for at least the last 3 years of understanding that white entitled people do have a built-in, and it's not just white people, but certain culture, that culture of people, the entitled culture, has a certain way of going into a business meeting or a meeting, a gathering, and having an agenda and having ways that we do things and expect everybody just to follow suit.
There's this fabulous book called The Start of Everything or The Dawn of Everything, and it's way too long and it's very complicated, but they are decolonizing the whole, the priests came to the United States to make people into Christians, and there's a conversation with a Native American leader who goes, well, okay, and compares and contrasts. And one of the things he said is like, you guys are always mad and you're always poor and you're always all these things. What if you do it like us? What if you, we don't have leaders. We have people who kind of facilitate a conversation. We have people who, I don't know, we get the systems that we want, and we perpetuate them because we want them to stay in place. And we don't work very hard to change things. So that, to me, is sort of what's next.
Well, and I think part of what happens in church, and you said it about the article before, is that so much of church became transactional, right? I mean, in the mere fact that the story wasn't about catching fish, was not about evangelizing or catching people to go to heaven. There was not a transactional piece about that, right? So anytime it becomes transactional, it involves one person at the expense of the other person, and that's really not relationship building. There's a story about a rabbi, and his disciples ask him how he prays, and if he prays, when he prays, does he go to heaven? And they ask him this question because every night after Shabbat, when they're able to go out again, so it's probably dawn of the next morning, they think he's disappeared into the forest to pray. That's their notion, right? Their rabbi disappears into the forest. So they think he's going there to pray by himself and he's lifted to heaven. This is what they've told themselves. So one day, isn't that great? So, and they want to be like that, right?
Yeah.
Like if he can do that,
Yeah.
we want that. So one day they decide to follow him into the forest. He goes into the forest and he opens the hut of a door, and there's this elderly, crippled woman. And he feeds her, and he bathes her feet, and he takes care of her. When she's taken care of, he leaves, and they are totally in dismay of what they've just seen.
I love that story.
Isn't that great?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, yep.
Yeah, because they built it up in their heads like, oh, he must go into the forest and he gets lifted up to heaven, and we want that. You know, he's so sacred and such a holy man. And meanwhile, he's over there bathing this woman's feet and feeding her.
Yeah. Following Jesus sort of maybe the way that even if he's not following Jesus, he's still doing those kinds of, I liked it in the article, the Jewish justice traditions.
Mm-hmm.
I like that idea of a justice tradition that's gone for many thousands of years beyond Jesus, beyond all kinds of things.
Yeah. So in the story, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times before he was crucified. So it's 3 times they use this symbolic 3 times thing that Christ gets to ask Peter again, do you love me? And that must have gotten really annoying. And I was by the 3rd time, like stop already, right?
Yeah.
But so I guess the question for us is, in your own life, when has love restored what has been broken by fear and betrayal for you?
Almost always. I mean, if I think about it, there's a wonderful poem by Mary Oliver about I worried about all this stuff and it never happened. And I think when you get to the point of your life, of saying, it's going to be enough to just be who I am, or that song about I might be hard to handle, but I'm okay. I'm going to be good. I am who I am. And the hard part for church is, if I am who I am, how do I let everybody else be who they are too? And we do that collectively. That's hard work, I think. I think I want to be the boss of the life, right? Don't we all? I think of my, as Elliot's been younger, I want my way every day, all the time. But we don't get that in life. And so how do we treat each other with respect? I'm not particularly good at this, I have to say. I recognize that in myself. But that's my challenge. Maybe our challenge for everybody is every day you have to wake up and practice not to be a jerk.
Yeah. So I think where love has restored me the most in my life, and this is why I remain a pastor, because I do, if you know me, I do have a lot of challenge with organized religion for a variety of reasons. But I think when I was ordained was the moment I felt that there was love in the world that really restored all of the broken pieces in me. That a body, a church, even an organization, but a group of people, the body of Christ, would have me as an ordained minister. So I hold that very, very dear to my heart. And it's been a blessing being on committee on ministry, because now I'm a mid-advisor. So that means I'm walking with somebody through the process. And now I'm working with a young woman who's a chaplain. She's spoken here, Christy. And she comes from a different faith tradition, and they started to get very legal with her about her words and all the way she was describing being UCC. It kind of didn't jive with what we know. So I had to keep my level of challenge and anger down a bit, but they've taken in this concept of being more curious about her and really listening to the faith journey and to see what she's doing rather than how she's articulating that. And they've decided to have her ecclesiastical council in the fall. So it's been such a blessing for me just to be a little girl in the Roman Catholic world who wanted to be an altar boy, which obviously not.
Yeah.
So, and then my brother being the altar boy, and he was just like a jerk about it. So I was like, I could do this. I want to do this. He doesn't want to do it. Let me do it. But yeah, I don't like being told I can't do things. And that's what I heard a lot in church life. But there was also, in the Catholic world, a very rich idea of everything was sacred, which that spirituality I think is beautiful. Mm-hmm. So again, you have on the one hand this abundance, this beautiful spirituality, and then the limitation for me was like the door just closed, like, so where do you go with that? And I, also becoming ordained midlife for me was huge. Like I kind of, like one pastor said to me, okay, is this a midlife crisis? I said, I really don't think so. I said, is there some of that in here? You better believe it.
Sure.
There's some of that is in here, but it's not a midlife crisis. Yeah, so I think that's where I have felt really restored.
I think this congregation is particularly good at that. I was pretty broken when I walked in.
Mm-hmm.
If I look back on it, I wouldn't have said that at the time probably, but this congregation has does a good job. Well, that's really not the language I want to use, but when we were meeting, and I think that's what's been so difficult about COVID, was when we couldn't look at each other and we couldn't touch each other, we couldn't hug and we couldn't extend conversations. And now we're kind of coming back to that again. And do I think that we're going to go back to old church? No. Mm-hmm. But that community
the
piece
human
of it
connection,
will be really lovely.
Yeah. And the one beautiful part about this church, and that was another restorative piece for me, was I would hear a lot of churches saying they wanted to change and they had progressive theology and they meant it, but they could never let go of their sacred cows, right? Every church has sacred cows. When I came and I found that this church had merged with another church, and that meant one church had to give up their building, I was like, wow, that is a pilgrimage that is beyond hopeful. You know, that's the doorway. That was the starting point, I think, for this church to be such a pronounced church of faith and restoration. Because I love the story of Walter telling people that he was the youth group in the church, you know, like he was 65 at the time, but he was the youth group. So I was like, wow, they are so realistic, and they did something. Mm-hmm. They didn't just whine like we need our building or whatever.
Why don't the young people come? Well, because we're boring.
Right. Let's put a sign out. Come on in so you can pay for our building.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else from this you'd like to add, or?
No, maybe a couple of invitations. If you are interested in being part of the budget process, please let either Clay or Cindy McKee know. Mm-hmm. If you're interested in being, once upon a time, apparently we had 3 or 4 people who were part of an investments group and could oversee kind of what our investments were. And now we have 1. And 1 is never good because all of us could be hit by a bus. And right now there's like only 1 person who knows how that all works. Be good if we had a couple more. And I think also, sometimes I think it's hard to say to people, well, here's what I wish you would do with all this money. Say it. Don't be afraid of that. Mm-hmm. You know, tap people on the shoulder, send emails, yell at us. Well, maybe not that, but you know, let us know that things aren't going in a way that you feel like you want them to go, especially financially. So I think that would be my invitation.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
So would you read back the poem, please?
I would. I particularly like this because I think it's probably
I like
true,
the maybes.
Yeah.
Right, the maybe,
yeah.
Perhaps.
I wonder if we will know when restoration comes. Will it feel big and dramatic like a summer rain, joyful and overwhelming like an end-of-war parade? Maybe. Or will it be small? Will it be pocket-sized moments of, like wishing on stars, the sun through the curtains, or lightning bugs in the yard? Maybe. I don't know how God will restore the world, just like I don't know how to make the summer rain. But I do know how to say I'm sorry. I do know how to love with all of me. And I know how to say, this cup is for you. And I know how to taste grace in grape juice. So on the off chance that restoration will be small, pocket-sized moments of love for all, I will bake bread and save a seat for you. I will say I'm sorry and say I love you too. I will plant gardens and look for fireflies. I will say prayers on shooting stars at night. And when the sun shines through my curtain windows, remind me to open them wide. I would hate to miss God's parade these holy, ordinary days. Thank you, Pastor Dianne.
Thank you, Sharon.